Good to see you this morning. I'm glad that you could be here for our Bible study before our worship service. Just a couple of things. There'll be a sheet that I will send out, starting on this side, going down this way, during worship service. Hopefully we'll come back up this aisle and line up with me for our lunch, dinner, whatever you want to call it, next Sunday, where we are feeding the ladies. We need to get at least an idea of how many people will be here. Ladies, if you don't attend, you're making a bad mistake, because those men are going away on you just a bit like slaves. So if you don't come, you're going to miss out. So please sign up, if you will, on this sheet during worship service. We'll start down this aisle, back up this aisle, and hopefully get to me so I'll be able to have a count. Give Jason. Jason said if you don't sign up and you show up instead of the pork, then he's going to agree with you get a hot dog. So Jason's mean. So we got to make sure that you get signed up. If you don't sign up, you still can come. But we need to get an idea of how many people are going to be here. Men, you got to be prepared to serve the ladies. That's what we're doing. We're serving them. We're cleaning up. They're not going to do anything but pick their fork up and their tea glass. That's all they're going to do. That's the hardest thing that the ladies are going to do that day. And that's Sunday, next Sunday at 2 o'clock is when our service will be, and we'll eat immediately after that. It's good to have Louie Claw back with us. Actually, back with me today, and he said that she was actually maybe doing a higher letter, and we're glad to hear that. Keep her in your prayers, keep them in your prayers. This is a difficult time, difficult sickness. Remember them all in your prayers and all those who are sick. Louie, I took all you down on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you guys for having us up today. I've put in a lot of mileage. I think from about 4:30 on Friday afternoon to right now, we put about 600 miles in. If I was trying to do the calculation in my head, but somewhere around there. By the end of Sunday, we'll might be close to 700. But no, we're happy to be here. We've had a great weekend. Got a chance to go visit with some of my brothers. I have 3 brothers. I think I mentioned before. We all went to school down in Jackson County at one time or another, and we got to see. There were 3 of us together. One was actually out of the country. One of them was getting an award. He was actually going into a sort of little Hall of Fame in the city that he lives in. He's been a long time coach there. And they were inducting a class, a couple of professional ball players, a couple of collegiate ball players in him. And so we were down there for that and got a chance to visit me. But I'm going to ask a favor. While we were there, my oldest brother, who got there just in time for the ceremony, but then right after the ceremony got a text that his grandson, my great-nephew, was being put in the hospital. They transported him, and he's got some sort of virus. I'm not saying it was COVID, but it's a lot like that. It's attacked his ability to breathe, and rough night out last night, and got him on oxygen, got him on continual breathing treatments. His name's Leon, and if you guys wouldn't mind keeping him in your prayers, he's is it in Birmingham?
Yeah.
Or the Children's Hospital down in Birmingham. So if you wouldn't mind, just keep him in your prayers that he might rebound. But anyway, hey, let's go ahead and get started. So today, I don't know if I should caution or call this a warning, but there is the potential that your eyes can roll back in your head and you can start drooling and fall over. I'm not saying it's going to be boring. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I'm gonna geek out a little bit on money and a little bit of history. And my reason for doing that is I'm actually going to speak during the sermon hour, during the worship hour, on this very topic. But I think sometimes money shows up in the Bible, and we don't have a great feel for how it fits in, how and why it's being characterized as this, because all we can say, that it's money. We don't necessarily have a great feel for how big a piece of money, how little a piece of money, and it's out. So that's what I'm going to do today. Going to really, as a preface for what we're going to talk about in the sermon, I want to walk you guys through money in the Bible. And so I thought the Sunday school hour might be a nice time to see that. I've actually got up there the old song, Money, 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 if you know what I'm talking about, the popular song. I don't even know who sings it. I don't know any other words than that, to be honest with you. I'm not for sure even. Do what? No, that's all I know. I just did. There you go. Yes, sir. If what? What's more important than money? Escapism. Well, if you got enough money, maybe your escapism can be even larger. I turned this class, the Heart Wallet Connection, because that's often what Jesus really does make as a connection, the overriding concern, every single one of us. I doubt there's a person sitting in this particular class that doesn't have an attachment to how money affects their lives, because it's part of the human condition. It just is. And it becomes part of the human equation. So I turn this and I frame it inside of study that I've been doing for quite a while personally, and have had a few classes on different parables of Jesus. I always like to note that as I approach the parables of Jesus, I try to approach it from this perspective, to take a look at how Jesus looks at how we look at things. And that's really how I try to do it. So it's how I personally study. You just get to go along for the ride. I hope it's of value to you. These are things I've wondered about over time, and I've just never taken the time to do it until now. So here we go. So first of all, when we look at parables, and you've seen all that sort of stuff, I keep those in there in case I ever teach this class again to someone who's never heard about my position on parables and stuff like that. But you guys have seen all that, so there's no reason to sit on that. But I do mention this. Jesus, of course, often mentions money in the parables. If not money, certainly commerce, which goes with that. So I want to point this out. So here's all the parables. Here's all the parables that are in Matthew and Mark. Okay? Some of them are repeated in Luke, but the ones that have green, well, and you might not be able to tell the differences in there. Unfortunately, when I send you guys a PowerPoint, for whatever reason, by the time it goes through my email to your email, it crosses the Continental Divide, goes between 3 counties. It gets changed. It just does. And then it probably goes across at least 3 different iOS type platforms. And so that's not the way it looks on my slide. Don't let that mess with you. But I promise I don't put 2 shades of green separated by, like 1 wavelength of light. They almost look exactly the same. But ultimately, what you're going to see is there is a lighter shade of green and there's a darker shade of green. And that lighter shade of green are all the ones where Jesus specifically mentions money. For instance, like the Matthew 13 parables with the hidden treasure and the owner of the house, or the lost sheep with the coin and the son. Those specifically, and obviously the one about the talents, I think I've done a lesson here on the parable of talents. Those are specifically about money, but so many of the other ones really still are about commerce, and money is the underlying currency of what Jesus is trying to get across to us, or at least to set that parable up. And those are the ones in Matthew and Mark. Then if you look in Luke also has a number of these are in Luke, and these are all the parables anyway that are in Luke, and they're only in Luke. But among them, you still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the 18 parables in Luke specifically about money. So it's a very common, a very oft used way that Jesus reaches into where we're at with our heart, but he shakes and rattles it using the topic of money. So let's take a look at money in Jesus' day. Again, I apologize for the slides, but it's just they're kind of repositioning some things. So I may have to really turn and look a lot there because they're not what I've got in my memory, but hey, they'll still work. So in the Roman Empire,
Before we really talk about money, I almost have to set this up. So let me see if I can do a quick job of it. This thing keeps bouncing around just a tad, so I'm going to move it to this side and see if I can not knock it around with my arm. So, the Roman Empire extended for a long period of time. But we think of Rome coming in around the 500 BC mark, just sort of around it. Rome as a city itself was a city that developed out of a need to protect themselves. So there were people. It was in a little village called Latinia, and then there was another village called Ustria, and so those two villages somewhat at odds with each other. There were some hill folks. They got 7 hills around Rome. That's part of the way the geography lays. And there were some hill folks where the folks of Latinia and the folks in the hills were being attacked by the Etruscans, and ultimately they pulled together. Now, archaeologists don't know for sure whether the Etruscan group won out or if they got together and fought for a while and then just decided, you know what, we're going to become our own society. But essentially they mixed together. And eventually, around 510, we feel like that's when Rome was established as a city. And so, ultimately, I got 510 up there. I think it's really a little further back than that, maybe around 600. But ultimately, by the time you get down to the 500s, I guess 625, that's when it was. That's when it was established. So 625 down to around the 500s, kings kind of ruled that little area, just like anybody else would, a particular kingdom. But the people of that area wanted to rule themselves. It mirrors, or maybe we as a country kind of mirror how Rome came about. And eventually they demanded of the last king of Rome, they demand that they institute a constitution of sorts. And so they do. And that was basically ending his kingship, and they set up a republic. And they set up this republic by representatives. They didn't have a senate like they eventually had later in Jesus' day, but it was something like that, representatives. Ultimately, though, they set up something called the 12 Tables, and it was a bunch of laws about how private, public, and political life would run. And also at that point in time, that's when they started really establishing how money was going to work for economy reasons. But ultimately, that lasted right up until around 40 BC. Okay? Now, around 40 BC, and there's a little lag between the two stages there because it's an unsure amount of time where there was some civil war going on, some other things, but eventually in Jesus' day, that part of the Roman Empire, we call that Imperial Rome because that's when they had rulers. For instance, if I remember right, Julius Caesar, we all had to read Shakespeare's version of Julius Caesar, and the only thing any of us can ever remember is Et tu, Brute, right? And ultimately, though, Caesar was a real guy. Julius Caesar was a real guy. July is named after him, in case you didn't know that. You think I could geek out on the money? You should get me talking about calendars and the days of the weeks and the months of the year. I can certainly put you to sleep with that. But ultimately, Julius Caesar, BC 51, that's about the time frame. He ends up getting killed down around the 30s. And then Mark Antony and Octavian ruled together for a little while. Then Mark Antony is the one that married the Egyptian princess. And so ultimately, he ends up dying or getting killed, however you want to look at that part of history. And then Octavius takes on the new name of Caesar Augustus. And of course, Caesar Augustus was going to be right around BC 30. So that's going to lead into Jesus' day. Now I say all that only to give you a feel, because if we go back and we look at Daniel 2, if you'll pull out your Bibles and go take a look at Daniel 2, If you remember, Daniel 2 is where Daniel really comes into his own inside of the Babylonian captivity time period, where he rises to the level of importance in that set of kingdoms in that particular day. It's talking about, if you look right at the beginning of Daniel chapter 2, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. So you remember, I bet we've had VBS stories on this. This is where Daniel essentially comes up, and someone tells us, look, out of the young men that we took out of Jerusalem, there's a set of them that are really special. They're really smart. They got trained. They got the best food. And you go through all that sort of stuff. But Daniel really rose to the top. He was already in a drawer full of sharp knives. He was the sharpest knife of all those captives. And ultimately, he had the ability to interpret these dreams. And if you'll notice, the king tried to get other people to interpret the dream. And if you go down to verse 17, you'll see that I'm trying to scroll down. I'm sorry, it's verse 31. You'll look down in verse 31. If you look there and you start reading down, you'll start to see that he interprets that dream. So that dream, this is the one where it has the great statue and had a head of gold, breastplate of silver, and then legs of iron. And then when you get down to the feet, if you'll remember, that the iron gets mixed with the clay. And yet, even though you think of that as being the least precious of the part that the statue was made out of, certainly gold being the most precious, silver, and then even the iron. But you get down where the iron and the clay are mixed, you start to see that this is him talking about this very earthy, very mixed group of people who were going to be a kingdom that was going to be the kingdom that when the Messiah came was going to be in rule, and it would be a mixture of people. And we saw Rome start this way, and that's certainly what happened all the way up into Jesus' day. And so I only mentioned Daniel 2 because not only is this the answer to a prophecy that was made in this revealing here, but we can see it stacked down through history that when Jesus' day came along, he was dealing with a culture that was a real mixture of cultures, very much multiculturalism going on there. When the Romans, by this time had become a pretty great sized kingdom, I also mentioned up here that eventually they become a divided kingdom. But in the time period of Jesus, when you're talking about the first century, we're looking at BC 6 all the way up to about AD 33. The reason why we always say BC 6 is because we don't actually know the actual year that Jesus was born. We don't know it. And that's because of our calendar now is a version of the Julian calendar. Our calendar we call the Gregorian calendar. And it fixed some problems that the Julian calendar had, but the Julian calendar was in place for over 1,000 years, some version of it. And it was off. They only had 10 months in it. That's why our last month of the year, I know it's the 12th month of the year, but the last month of the year is actually named in Latin, December. That's the Latin term for 10. Just like November is the Latin term for the 9th month. The only reason why they're the 11th and 12th month is because the two Caesars that got months named after them, Julius got July put in there, so they stuck that in there. And then eventually Caesar Augustus wanted his own month, and so he named himself a deity, and we stuck August in there. And so it pushed those two down. But yeah, October, November, December, well, September is for 7. So those are just Latin terms, but their year really only had 10 months in it, and it was off. And so the seasons were getting all shifted around, and it was causing a lot of problems, especially in the religious world, because we like to calculate when the date of Easter is going to happen based on the equinox, and we can see that as a physical event, but it wasn't marrying up with our calendars, and it really had things messed up. And so ultimately, our Julian calendar fixed that, and it went through a couple of machinations as well. All that back to say, in Jesus' day, there was a time period where the calendar just is so messed up, we're not for sure when certain years were. And so there's this lag time of 4 to 6 years around what we might think of as year 0 or the end of BC and the start of AD that we don't know exactly where that is. We just don't. So we kind of pick a time and go with it. Now, that being said, what's that got to do with money? Everything. It really does. So ultimately, and by the way, you had the imperial Rome, when all the emperors were in place, they're going to stay in place for a good while. Realistically, they come into place just before Jesus is born. And of course, it was under Augustus's rule that rule was made about going back to your hometown and taking a census so that taxes could be paid. And that's why Jesus, goes all the way back, or that's why Jesus' father is taking his family all the way back to Nazareth, and that's why he's going to end up being born. All prophesied that it was going to happen. But ultimately, that runs all the way up into the 4th century, 360, before they divide. And then what we think of as the Western Roman Empire, it eventually, by AD 400, it's pretty much gone. That eastern part of it, sometimes people don't call it the Western Roman Empire, they call it the Byzantine Empire. It lasts till the 15th century, until the Turks come in and take it over and eventually win and establish what we now call the modern day Turkey. But anyway, all that being said, there were a number of cultures in this area that not only had rule, but were minting coins and were minting money. So obviously in Jesus' area, you're going to have money that is coming out of the Hebrew culture. You're going to have money that's coming out of the Iron Legs, the Greeks, because they had that area under control prior to the Romans. And then of course you had the Romans who were minting and utilizing their own coinage as well. So all that shows up in the Bible. It can be confusing. So I just wanted to kind of shine a little bit of a light. We'll illuminate it so that when you're studying and you see things, you can go, oh yeah, I see why that's that way. That's really all I'm trying to do today. So ultimately, let's start right here. We all probably remember the story of the widow's 2 mites. If you happen to take one of those Jerusalem tours, there'll be vendors who sell 2 little bitty coins that you can buy when you're over there. And they're modern day versions, replicas of the widow's mites, okay? So it's realistically maybe about the smallest, and I only say maybe because you're always hearing archaeological digs that find a new coin or a new thing that they didn't know existed. But as it sits right now, we're thinking of this as pretty much about the smallest amount of money that someone could actually have a coin for. So I've given you a picture of 2 mites that are pretty much from that day. These are actual replicas, they're not actual mites. But ultimately, they would look like that. And I took a picture that I found where somebody had them in their hands so that you can see the size of them. We kind of akin this to pennies today, even though the term penny is a translated term that we see in the Bible, and it'll show up in this study today. But ultimately, 2 mites. Each one of those, by the way, if or mite is going to be a Greek term, the Roman term for it is a lepta or a lepton. But ultimately, they were some of the lowest coins, copper or brass, some of the least of the precious metals that were being used, easy to form, and they were stamped. And they were the smallest denomination of coin. So if you did have 2 mites, if you look over in Mark, let's look at this story, because this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. While this isn't a parable, if you look in Mark, this is something that Jesus pointed out. And so I want to show it to you as well. So if you look at Mark, I think it's going to be down in the 40s. Yeah, down in 41. And it says that Jesus sat opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums. So if you remember from our study before, we talked about there was a tithing And then there was offering. Tithing was a tax that you paid, and it was collected throughout the year and at certain points. But there were at least 6 different versions of offerings, and you did them for specific reasons. Could be that you had a sin in your life and you did it. Could be that you just had a peace offering. You were just grateful to God. And then there was actually an offering for how well you'd been blessed. And so all of it had to do with your ability to pay. And so Jesus was pointing out in the story, this was not a parable. This was actually what Jesus' eyes were seeing. But he's pointing out in this story that this little lady, even though she put in about as small a sum as a person might put in, it was a huge sum to her. And that would be referring back to that particular offering that had to do with what you had in your own, under your own control. In other words, how much you had profited, how wealthy were you, how much had God blessed you. She had given such a huge portion, because as Jesus eventually points out, it's pretty much all she had. But ultimately, it mentions this coin, and we always focus on the 2 mites, but it actually, Jesus or the scriptures actually tell us what the coins are worth. It says that if you look at in verse 41, it says that he sat watching them, and he said in verse 42, a poor widow came in and put in 2 small copper coins, which make, I'm reading the ESV, which make a penny. Now you guys may have a version that say a quadrantes, okay? A quadrante. So let's take a look at that. So ultimately, the quadrantes is the Greek term. There is a Latin term that probably sounds a little more like what we're used to, because our language is Latin-based, which is a quadran. So you may actually have a version that says quadran. And what that means is the amount that 2 mites were worth was this quadran, and a quadran was 1/64th of a denarius. Now, we've all heard of the denarius, but we'll eventually get to it. But it gets used a number of times in the scriptures. But ultimately, this quadran is considered a quarter of some other version of coin. And so you can think of a quadran like a quarter, but it's not, doesn't have the same value of our quarter. But ultimately, that's why it was called a quadran, because it actually meant 1/4. But in this case, what was its value? Well, it was still a very, very, very small amount. So the lady put in 2 mites that was actually worth a quadran, and that was 1/64th of a denarius. By the way, that's a picture that I got from, there's a numismatic coin collector group that I kind of stay associated with. I'm not a member of them. I just use their website a lot and everything, because I don't collect coins, but there's something that I do with old coins that I do sort of collect. So anyway, I have this group, and I was able to pull off of their website an actual picture of one of these quadrants from Jesus' day, and that's what it would look for. And it wouldn't be a whole lot larger than the coin that you saw earlier. Now, something that shows up a number of times in the scriptures is a denarius. Also, you'll hear the plural denarii. And it typically was a Roman coin, silver coin, sometimes not pure silver, but certainly a silver coin. And it was the wage of a common laborer. Okay? Now, I've mentioned once in another lesson the drachma, and I'll show you that here in a second. But this is what I want you to picture in your head. This was what you got paid if you hired out as a farmhand. Let's say you hired out to a farmer, and you went out to that farmer, and he said, hey, I need 10 guys to come out because I got to cut a wheat field. And so they go out and they cut the wheat field. They bind them all and they bring them all back in, right? And so if you'll remember, we've had that story from Jesus where he talks about, and it would be a parable, but he talks about the laborers that get hired and they work all day long, and then at the end of the day, the landowner still has people to hire because he still needs to get some work done, and he hires people in at the very last hour of the day. At the end of the day, he still pays them a denarius or a penny. And the people who worked all day long get mad about it, right? I believe I would be like those people. I'm just going to be honest with you. I work 10 hours, and you give me a denarius, and then this person comes up and only works an hour, and they get a denarius. And of course, Jesus comes on and says, hey, isn't this what we agreed upon? I didn't short you in any way. Isn't it my money to do what I want to do with? So I'm sure you remember the story, but ultimately, that's what we're talking about. Oh, I can't not tell you this. So if you were cutting the wheat and you were binding it, and you go walking up with the wheat, okay, you're going to take that and you're going to weigh that wheat. But when the wheat gets to the mill, they're going to undo that, and that wheat will have the wheat, but there's also a weed that grows in there. Oh, you'll remember this. It's called a tare, T-A-R-E, okay? Now, if you remember back to your high school chemistry, you had some little weighing things, and you had to do what was called a tare weight. So if you weighed out something in a little cup or on a piece of paper, you had to put it on there, and then what you had to do is you had to weigh that paper, then you put all your stuff on it, or the little cup, you put all your stuff on it, and then you got the weight of that, and then you had to go back and you had to take out the weight of your container, okay? If you go over to the Sumner County dump, I don't know if any of you guys have any reason to go there. It's a horrid place. It smells bad. I'm not knocking the folks who work there, but you won't get treated super well. And everybody there wants nothing more than just to dump their stuff and get out of there. So everybody throws it in the wrong place, including me. Because they got 9 different places for you to throw stuff. It's confusing on where you're supposed to put it. And the second you put it out there, a guy come and yell at you, hey, get it out of there. It's supposed to go over here. You go put it over there, and then another guy come and yell at you, don't put it there, put it there. Am I wrong, Flo? Oh, it's frustrating. But when you first pull up in your vehicle, you pull up there in your truck, and you got 2.5 tons of truck, right? And you got 70 pounds of trash or whatever you're throwing away. So you pull up on this weight, you got your 5,000 pounds of vehicle plus the 70 pounds of your stuff. So you go and you go throw out your stuff, and then you come back and they weigh your vehicle, and they take the difference because your vehicle was the receptacle. It shouldn't count. They take that out all the way back to the wheat. So when they carried the wheat, there's actually a story that Jesus talks about separating the wheat from the tares. And that's where we get the term of tare weight, is because you used to actually take the wheat, weigh it, and then when they would spread the wheat out, they would pull the tares out of there, because guess what? You're not going to grind them. They don't have any wheat germ on there. You're not going to get anything out of it. And then they would weigh the tares, and they would subtract that from the amount that they would pay for the wheat. Boy, that's a long way to reach around. You see how geeky I can get about this? You'll never invite me back, will you? Anyway, coming on, here we are, denarius. 1 penny is what a person gets for working all day long when they don't have any particular skill. Then there's the drachma. This is a Greek word. Now, the term drachma, interesting enough, shows up in the Old Testament. Look over in Ezra. Look in Ezra in your Bibles. I bet you're going to see the term or one of its generic terms. So if you look over in Ezra, that's one of those books that nobody can find easily. It's toward the end of the books of history, right? So it's after Chronicles. You got Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Ezra and Nehemiah is talking about where they come back out of Babylonian captivity, and they're rebuilding the walls and then eventually rebuild the temple. So you remember all that. So ultimately, what you're going to notice in Ezra chapter 2, you're going to see that it says, now these were the people out of the province who came up out of captivity of those exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried into Babylonia. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each their own town. So what they're saying is this, look, the Babylonians took over. The Babylonians, had gone in and taken most of the land of Judah and all the people in Jerusalem, and they'd taken them into captivity under King Nebuchadnezzar. He eventually died out. And realistically, eventually you get down to where you have the Xerxes and Darius and that group, and they were Persian rulers that had basically taken over Babylonia. And so ultimately, by the time they come back, they're going back to resettle the land. The walls have been rebuilt, the temple's been rebuilt, okay? So we're talking right now, this time period, mid-400s. I want to say one of the dates is 458. They came back in sessions, but mid-450s. And remember, we're talking BC, so as you go higher in number, you're going further back in time, as opposed to now when you go higher in number, you're going further into the future. So about 450. I want to say that the temple was finished around 516, and so we've got this about 72 year lag in between, and now they're starting to head back. But if you go down, I want to say I put the verse up there. Yeah. So if you go down, you look at Ezra 2, got a bunch of verses. They divided this book up, so that it just so happened to have a ton of them. But if you look down in verse 69, once the people all settled in, all came back from Babylonian captivity, here's what it says. It says, according to their ability, they gave to the treasury of the work 61,000. Your Bible may say drachma. Your Bible may say derricks. Or it may have one other term. I'm trying to remember. I think maybe dagma, I think is the other term. Those are the three. They're sort of interchangeable. You may go, well, isn't that Greek? And you go, yeah, it is Greek. I get that. But aren't these people coming from Babylonia? Yes, I get that too. But remember, the Greeks were in charge of things before the Romans came in charge of things. There are two stories in our Western civilization that I can probably bring up that will help you to understand this. Okay, so 490 BC, right in the middle of this time period we're talking about. If you've ever watched the Olympics, or if you've ever watched one of these running things where all the really skinny people run for a long ways, what do we call them? We call it a marathon. Comes from a famous battle that the Greeks and the Persians had as they were clashing, and the Persians were trying to extend their kingdom, and the Greeks were like, oh, no, you're not. And basically, on the plains of Marathon, a scout saw the Persians coming and took off running, and he ran. And he ran 26.2 miles. That's what we call it now. He ran some number of stadia, they would have called it. But 26.2 miles, as hard as he could go, as fast as he could go, to warn the Greeks. And then he falls over dead. And they go up to Marathon, and they beat the Persians back. And so he's honored, and was honored with, and that's why they run that race of the marathon in honor of that moment. That was 590, okay? You probably at least know about, if you've never seen, there's a kind of a semi-famous action film called 300, and it's based on a relatively true story. A lot of the stuff in the movie isn't quite all true, but generally it is fairly true that the king of Sparta went up to a little area called Thermopylae, and in that area purposely fought the Persian invasion to keep them out of Sparta, because they did come down and overtake Athens after this fight. But the Persians did take the king and 300 of his men, and they held them there long enough for Sparta to really start gathering. The movie would have you believe to gather political favor enough to go to war against the Persians. But ultimately, for whatever reasons why he did it, he held them off long enough that Sparta got to keep themselves from ever really losing their ground to the Persians. But Athens did fall to the Persians. Why am I bringing all this up? The Persians are the people that had our Jewish folks that we're talking about. They were called Jews after they came back from Babylonian captivity. Prior to that, they were called Hebrews. But since it was only Judah that was taken, when they came back, they had taken to calling themselves Jewish and Jews, because that was short for Judah, right? So ultimately, we're talking about those people. When they came back into the Palestine area, they were coming back from Persia, and Persia was in this war with the Greeks over that time period. And so that money It was all getting mixed up. It was all out there. And they hang on to money for a long, long time in those days. We don't use doubloons. But boy, wouldn't you love to find some, right? Some of that pirate gold, because they're worth so much. Well, back then, the money, once it was minted, would stay and stay and stay and stay until somebody melted it down. So ultimately, you had this Greek drachma that, yeah, it does show up in the Old Testament, but we see it in Jesus' day. And in Jesus' day, it's fairly regulated. It is a Greek coin. The Greeks are not in power anymore, but it's still the common language. Koine Greek is what the Bible's written in, okay? It's the common written language of that day. It was the language of business in that day. Granted, the Hebrews could write in Hebrew. The Romans could probably write in Latin, sure. But in general, all in that area, Koine Greek is what you wrote things down on. And a lot of their coinage was out there. So it was part of the everyday. Now, since it was part of the everyday, I want to mention that it was a Greek coin. It was a silver coin. Notice that it's got the little owl. Anytime you see coinages with owls, it's probably an homage back to the Greeks, because that was the way the Romans had the eagle, the Greeks had the owl. Just in case you're looking backwards in history. So here we go. It was a typical day's wage for a skilled worker. So if you were an IT guy, they didn't have those back then. But if you were a carpenter, right? If you were a carpenter and somebody needed an addition, they married into a family and they're going to build a house on now for, I think there, we won't get into who attaches to what household. But anyway, but a lot of times someone would marry into a family and you would build on to a structure. And so maybe you had a stonemason, maybe you had a carpenter, maybe you had someone like that, a skilled laborer. That person got this coin. This coin was more, had a higher value than the denarius, which was for a unskilled laborer. So you had the drachma. It was a silver coin, right? And basically it comes up in a couple of things. I think I've talked about a drachma once before, talking about the parable of the talents. So there's also the mina. The mina shows up in the Old Testament. It does. But it's a form of weight, but it is also, by the time of Jesus' day, becomes a coin. And so you have a mina, and I'll have a picture over here in a minute, but I do want to mention that a mina is 100 drachma, but it's also can be based on 60 shekels. Shekels were the weights that were coming out of the old Hebrew. I put up some other stuff. You don't want to get into all the 1/10,000ths and 1/3,000ths and 1/1500ths. Just understand that shekels was the Hebrew version of making smaller denominations of money, and it was all really based on weight, as most money was. Fun fact, if you carry $10 in dimes and you go get $10 in quarters, they weigh the exact same amount of money. If you have, let me add this one thing. If you have them all from 1964 or further back, they actually weigh the same amount. You get $1,000 in quarters, get $1,000 in dimes, and they're all from 1964 back, they'll both weigh 55 pounds. And because money was actually made based on how big it was, because how big it was if it was precious metal, told you how much it was worth. So nowadays we don't make them out of silver because silver is worth so much more that little bitty coins have to be made out of things that aren't worth very much, like zinc and different alloys. So anyway, then you had, of course, the mina coin. And that mina coin, that shows up in at least one parable, if not two, and it's worth 100 drachmas. So if you had a mina, that's going to be 2.5, almost 3 months of wages, almost a quarter of wages for a year. And then, here's my last part. Man, I timed that wonderfully well, because 9:45 is when I step away from the microphone. Then there's the talent. We've already talked about it once before, and I gave you some kind of stats and that other thing, but I think this one really drives it home a little bit better. So when we talk about a talent, again, a weight measurement, but if you were looking down here at the very far end, you're going to see 1 gram of gold, an actual gram of gold. I know we don't do the metric system very well. I know Jimmy Carter tried to make us go to that back in the late 70s. It's probably one of the reasons why he lost the election to Ronald Reagan, among others. But ultimately, we kicked to the curb the metric system a long time ago, and none of us like thinking about it. But boy, if you're a scientist, you got to live with it. A gram of gold, teeny amount, yet it's still pretty expensive. If we grow the amount up to a kilogram, which is 1,000 grams, it's going to be about the size of my cell phone if you make a little tile out of it, okay? That's a kilogram size piece of gold. If you have one of those, if you have 34 kilogram size pieces of gold, tiles of gold, they're going to weigh in total almost a 74.8, but right at 75 pounds. That's a talent. That's a talent, and it'll be over $2 million in today's worth. So, when we start talking here in the worship hour, and we start talking about monies, I just wanted to give you some background. Was it too much? Probably so. But don't say you don't. If nothing else, go back and look at this. I think y'all record and keep these. If you ever need it again, here it is. You don't have to Wikipedia anything. It's coalesced all into one spot for you. But that's how the money that was mentioned in the Bible. Is there more? Oh, there's mucho more. There's so much more money stuff out there that you can get lost in it. And some people do. I don't. I stop at where the Bible's at because it only pops up there. So those are the monies that are mentioned in the Bible. I hope it's been profitable for you. Let's end with a prayer, and we'll call it a Sunday school. If you bow with me, please. Father in heaven, thank you for giving us your word. We're always amazed, and yet maybe we should never be amazed of how detailed your word is, but how those details always truly match what we know in history. We're so grateful for that. It's a comfort to us. It helps us to not only understand the context that you are trying to teach your lessons through, but in a day and age where people want to drift away, call you not real, and that call your word inaccurate, that it continually shows itself to be accurate. So we thank you for that. We thank you for that comfort. Watch over us as we go into the worship hour. We pray that you'll help us to not only study your word, but to make the application from your word that leads to an eternity with you. We're so grateful for all your gifts, and especially for your Son, through whom which we have that eternity. We praise you for that, and we're grateful. It's in Christ we pray.